Chapter 2, Economic Models, Trade-offs, and Trade, pages 30 to 34. And the learning targets for this lecture are how trade leads to gains for an individual or an economy, the difference between absolute and comparative advantage, and how comparative advantage leads to gains from trade in the global marketplace. Interdependence occurs because people are better off when they specialize and trade with others. If we didn't trade with others, we would be a lot like on Little House on the Prairie, doing all of our own stuff, growing our own food, and sewing our own clothes. So interdependence means that we're going to work with other people and trade with them. Patterns of production and trade are based upon differences of opportunity cost. So it's not necessarily who's the best at it or who's the quickest, but it's about who gives up the least amount when they produce that good, and then they know that they should trade. I'm not sure if you really need to write down much on this slide. You know most of this. It says the decision to produce any good or service has an opportunity cost. We know that. Here's an example that I'll use. It says, for instance, if you had the choice of producing Christmas cards or wrapping presents, and you choose Christmas cards, your opportunity cost is obviously wrapping presents. That's what you gave up. Given the choice of producing one good or another, it is more efficient to produce the good with the lowest opportunity cost. Again, it's not a matter of whether you produce it the quickest or the best. It's a matter of who gives up the least amount when they produce that item. So in the scenario below, and you don't need to write this, just an example, it says if you could produce 15 Christmas cards in the same amount of time it would take you to wrap 10 presents, well, then you would want to do the Christmas cards because 15 is obviously greater than 10, and that would be the lowest opportunity cost. Otherwise, if you decide to wrap the presents, you'd only do 10 of them, and you give up 15 Christmas cards. So you want to do the one with the lowest opportunity cost. You need to know the difference between absolute advantage and comparative advantage as stated in learning targets. Absolute advantage is really quite simple. You're basically looking at who can do it the quickest with the least amount of resources. Who's the most efficient at it? That's absolute advantage. So if it takes me an hour to clean the house and it takes my wife an hour and a half, well, I would have absolute advantage. I would be better at doing that. That's pretty simple to look at. Here's the scenario below. It says if Chris can produce 15 Christmas cards in the same amount of time that it takes Kringle to produce 10, you like that? Sometimes I have too much time on my hands. We say that Chris has an absolute advantage in the production of Christmas cards because he can produce it the quickest. Let's look at a more real-life example here. Labor hours need to produce a unit of cloth and wheat. We'll look at two different countries, Portugal and England. Portugal, it takes them 10 hours to produce a unit of wheat. And for cloth, it takes them 20 hours. For England to produce a unit of wheat, it takes them 20 hours. For cloth, it takes them 60 hours. So who has absolute advantage? In other words, who can do it the quickest with the least amount of resources? Well, the answer for wheat, we look at that one, and it looks like Portugal. It takes them 10 hours compared to 20. How about cloth? Well, for cloth, it takes Portugal 20 and England 60. They have absolute advantage in both products. So the question is, why should Portugal trade at all? If they can do both of them better, isn't it obvious that they should just do everything? But again, it's not based on absolute advantage. It's based on who has the lowest opportunity cost. and that's looking at a term called comparative advantage. And both parties can win in that situation. A simple definition here for comparative advantage says given any two products, a person has a comparative advantage in the product with the lowest opportunity cost. So who gives up the least amount when, in this instance, baking food or fixing a car? If you're looking to trade with someone, who gives up the least amount when they do that? This comes to a little bit harder slide here. This might take a little bit of time to understand. And requires some math. It says how many hours, so we're looking at time, does it take to produce a unit of wheat and cloth? And then we want to think about who gives up the least amount. Because it's not based on absolute advantage, it's based on who has the lowest opportunity cost. And so I don't know if you need to write down this whole paragraph here, but it says the opportunity cost of wheat in Portugal, well, it takes them 10 hours to produce a unit of wheat. So what could they have done with that 10 hours? Well, it takes 20 hours to produce a whole unit of cloth, so that means they would only be able to produce half a unit of cloth in those 10 hours. So what did they give up? Well, they gave up half a unit of cloth. So it says if it was decided to produce another unit of wheat, then half a unit of cloth would have to be given up, since the labor would be pulled off cloth production, and it takes 20 hours to produce a unit of cloth. So the opportunity cost of wheat is 10 over 20, and is a half unit of cloth. Well, what about the opportunity cost of cloth? How do we know how much that would be? Well, if it takes them 20 hours to produce a unit of cloth, what could they have produced in those 20 hours? You got it, 2 units of wheat. And it's really quite simple. If you can figure out one of these answers, the other is quite simple because it's the reciprocal of that answer. So if one is half a unit of cloth, then you know the other one's going to be the reciprocal, which is going to be 2 wheat that you give up. Some former students of mine have this helpful hint that I really like to share with you. It is taught, time on top. If we were dealing with time, then that would go on top. So whatever I say, if I say the opportunity cost of, and if I say wheat, then that goes on top. So wheat would go on top, that'd be 10 over 20. If I say what's the opportunity cost of cloth, then it'd be cloth over wheat. It's kind of just a simple memory device that will help you hopefully understand this and help you do well when it comes to the exam time. So the next step then is to look at England's opportunity cost for both wheat and cloth. So go ahead and try to figure that out on your own. You can pause the video, look back at your notes, and try to figure out how to find that out. Hopefully you realize, again, if you go time on top, it would be, for the opportunity cost of wheat would go on top. So it would be 20 over 60. Or, in other words, 1/3. They would give up a third unit of cloth that they could have produced. And the opportunity cost of cloth, then, again, is quite simply the reciprocal. So it's going to be 3 units of wheat that they give up, or 60 over 20. So what the heck does that all mean? Well, let's take a look here. We found the opportunity cost of cloth and wheat for both Portugal and England. If we look at this, then we can say, okay, looking at wheat, if I produce wheat, Portugal gives up half a unit of cloth. England, on the other hand, only gives up a third unit of cloth. So who gives up the least amount? Well, it's England. And so English can produce wheat because they only give up the third unit of cloth. Well, what about cloth then? Who gives up the least amount when producing cloth? Well, Portugal, when they produce cloth, they give up 2 units of wheat. England, on the other hand, gives up 3 units of wheat. So Portugal has the lowest opportunity cost when producing cloth. Ricardo showed that if each country produced only the good in which it held a comparative advantage and traded for the other product, then both countries could consume more of both goods. And again, that would increase our production possibility curve and shift it out to the right if we were to do this. And that, again, is why the United States doesn't want to produce everything by themselves. They, in fact, want to trade with other countries. Well, hopefully you kind of understood the time on top. Now we're going to try one other way, and that's when we talk about units. So how many units can be produced in an hour? We have 2 guys here stranded on an island. Imagine that. Tom and Hank. I know, isn't this a creative slideshow? Tom he can get 15 fish in an hour. Or he could climb a tree and gather 5 coconuts. Hank, on the other hand, he can catch 10 fish in an hour, or he is a fantastic tree climber and get 20 coconuts. Some of my students in the past came up with this idea of units under, kind of the opposite of time on top. This is just another way to remember how to do the math. And so units under means that when I say the opportunity cost of whatever that next product is I'm talking about, then that would go under. So for Tom, when I say the opportunity cost of fish, fish would go under. So it'll be 5 over 15. He gives up third coconut. For Hank, when I say the opportunity cost of fish, that goes under, so it'll be 20 over 10, he gives up 2 coconuts. So who has the lowest opportunity cost between Tom and Hank? You're right, Tom has the lowest opportunity cost, so that's what he should produce. Now we can do, again, very simply, we can look at the reciprocal of each of those and figure out the next part. It says that Tom, for every coconut he gives up, is 5 over 15 over 5. Or he gives up 3 fish, in other words. And remember, he gave up a third coconut, so we know 3 over 1 would be 3 fish that he could have gotten. Hank, for every coconut he gives up, is 10 over 20, or half a fish. So who gives up the least amount? You got it. Hank did. You guys are doing great.